Hey, welcome back to another edition of AGI, Advance, Grow, and Innovate with AI, where we try to break it down into terms that lay people who don't have computer science backgrounds can understand. Today, I am joined by David Bruemmer, who is like major robotics guy. Worked with and done consulting with DARPA and the federal government in the past. He's a founder and CEO of W8less. It's a pretty heavy hitter for this show. So thanks for joining us, David.
Hey, my pleasure. It's great to be on the show.
You want to give us a little background on yourself, and then we can dive. I have so many questions I want to ask.
Sure, yeah. My background's been in robotics, designing mostly systems for the military, but also many for industry. Primarily for the military, doing landmine detection, doing convoys, mapping out radiation, mapping out chemicals, and really sort of ensuring that these robots can function from very distant, remote locations, making sure that they can, have the intrinsic intelligence necessarily to respond well in a harsh world. But also, throughout the whole process, really focusing on what I like to call collective intelligence, which really has to do with how things interoperate at scale. I've also been involved then in bringing this out into cell phones and into micromobility on scooters, into mining vehicles, into forklifts, into really a host of telecom and automotive applications. And what I found throughout all of these operations is that in addition to the usual sort of need to build intelligence and autonomy, there's also a need for good positioning. Because like I say, no matter how smart the robot is, if the garbage coming into it is not sort of bolstered by accurate, positioning, it won't be able to figure out a good solution. So at the end of the day, I like to say autonomy is a tertiary issue. Intelligence is a secondary issue, but the primary issue is just truth, right? Are you providing truth into the system?
I never thought about it that way with robotics. I definitely see that in large language models, like people thinking that they're not getting a good experience because they're just using foundation out of the box foundation models and not feeding them the appropriate context. It's a game changer when you're providing the more context as to what your ROI desires are or what your processes are. So I could see it being the same in robotics, and I just never thought about it. My only real experience with anything autonomous was my trip to San Francisco when I got in a Waymo, and that was a pretty cool experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess when I define intelligence, I think of it as a principled connection between sensing and action, but based on actionable feedback. And I think that last part is really important because if we're not linking the behavior to the real world, then it's not embodied and situated, and therefore it's not real intelligence. I think it is possible to argue that you can have what I would call knowledge processing or information intelligence and maybe define that differently. But ultimately, from a robotics perspective, and even I would say a philosophical perspective, although that can be valuable, it's not the same thing as intelligence that is steeped in the real world and able to deal with chaos. I think when I look at all of the different, 50 or so different kinds of robots that I've deployed, they're all real world applications and they're all embodied in an actual robot with actuators and wheels and tracks and arms and grippers and all that kind of stuff. And this may sound very obvious because most people would say, well, obviously that's what robotics is, but large language models are not embodied for the most part. So part of the irony here is that what the world is right now being told to consider as like AI, arguably isn't AI at all. And most people would say, no, it's literally like the definition of AI. That's what 99% of investors think about when they think about AGI. They think large language models. But I'm here to tell you that by definition, that is not the case. And this is very controversial right now to the tune of like $200 billion, of investment that would say the other conclusion is true. They would say, no, there's plenty of evidence showing that we can link large language models to actual real world events. And that is true. You can discretize things. And in a sense, The game of war is discretized into the game of chess, right? You have a king, you have a queen, you have knights, you know, like it's actually a discretization, and it is reasonable, and it is fun, and it's very complex. And you could argue it takes a lot of intelligence to play chess. But my point is that at the end of the day, it is Markovian, meaning it is possible in the game of chess to look at all the states, not only the little squares on the board, but also the movement and the position of each of those pieces. Do you see what I'm saying? But fundamentally, the world that I live in is a crowded ice skating rink. Do you see what I mean? I am able to delude myself for some short span of time into thinking that I can map and plan and discretize, which is what large language models desperately need. And in fact, to not equivocate any further, they literally cannot function without that discretization. And most people are probably like, what do you mean by discretization? All it really means is that you can map the real world into discrete states that can be assigned to a token. And at the end of the day, that's all a large language model is doing. Now, if all of that was too technical, let me make it even simpler. When a tiger hunts in the forest, they are not using language models, and they are not using language at all. Do you see what I mean? And this is sort of like an irrefutable, obvious point. But guess what? When a fox moves, when ants, build entire complex civilizations, when bees swarm and pollinate, millions and trillions of plants, like none of that has anything to do with language. And furthermore, when Messi makes really good passes and everyone says, oh my God, he's brilliant, again, has nothing to do with language. Do you see what I mean? And no one can really argue with me about that. So there must be really important processes of intelligence that are not linked to language, number one. Number two, arguably, we can say that language is a possible effect of intelligence, but certainly not its cause. And now this last part, I concede, is somewhat objectionable and controversial, but I'm going to basically make the argument that we have absolutely no evidence in biology whatsoever that language produces intelligence. What we really see is that motion and embodiment and real-world action is what produces intelligence. And if it was not for these lower structures in the mammalian brain, like the brainstem and the cerebellum, we would not get what we call general intelligence. And so in a very real sense, and I'll stop here because I've been on one of my many tirades on this, the point I'm trying to make is that intelligence is at its core, in all of the biological embodiments that we have ever seen, it is really about dealing with chaos. It is not about playing chess. The problem is that from an investor perspective, and investors are very much the issue here, investors love to see language-based intelligence because they understand it, and quite literally they can visualize it and appreciate it. Do you know what I mean? So they love it. It gives them joy to see a beautiful map of San Francisco and to see that getting related to little pedestrians and icons of trucks and icons of cars, and they're like, yay, this is really intelligent. But my point is like, well, wait a second. If we define intelligence as the ability to deal with that which we have not yet seen, and that which we have not yet reduced to language, and that which we have not yet put into our chess game, then language models don't just suck, they completely and utterly fail. Utterly fail. And this is the difficult sort of philosophical issue, is that you have an entire community, not just roboticists and not just AI people, but arguably our politicians and our leaders and our investors writ large, who desperately want intelligence to come from maps and models. And I'm here to tell you that it does not. Do you know what I mean? That although I do think maps and models have a value, it is not the source of intelligence. Do you see what I mean? And so if we really want AGI, then we have to move beyond maps and models and think about something much, much deeper. All right, back to you.
Okay, I have lots of thoughts, and I'm probably going to show how ignorant I am here. Like, I'm a high school graduate. I don't have a PhD, but a lot of the people listening to this are the same. So I
But
want
Jason,
to go
are
through
you
the whole.
intelligent?
Well, I would argue that Stephen Hawkins is proof that you can have intelligence without mobility, for starters.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, I don't know if he would have agreed with that in the sense that he was quite mobile. I mean, he went all over the world and interacted with the universe in many different ways. He may not have had legs, but that does not mean that he was not mobile, and that does not mean that he was not embodied, right? So, in other words,
No,
like
but
as a
in
human
the same
being,
sense that, like Google Vision, I could move around the world as well, and that large language model would have just as much of an experience of the visual world as Stephen Dawkins did. But it can't move, and neither can he.
well, I guess insofar as Stephen moved all over the world and interacted with the real world, I think he is an example of embodied intelligence. And I think if you take Google Glasses or choose whatever device you want, and you think of it as being in the real world, dealing with chaos, dealing with anything from dust and rain and fog and snow to the vagaries of communication, the vagaries of movement, then indeed those things have the capacity to meet my criteria of intelligence. So I'm actually not saying, to be clear, that either Stephen Hawking's would fail my test of embodiment, because he certainly passes it. And I would also say that robots and even glasses that move in the real world, pass my test of embodiment. Does that make sense? Whereas if it is purely a large language model living in a server in Mountain View, then it does not pass my test.
And this gets to the, like, for a lay audience, where I think, and I may explain this completely wrong, right? But my understanding of the difference between Waymo and Tesla's self-driving models is that Waymo is pretty much using LiDAR, and it's set up on a grid, and it's kind of predetermined where these things are going to go, and they're never going to get smart. Whereas what he's trying to do with Tesla is to put large language models into a vehicle and let them learn and teach each other, by interaction in their environment, how to actually drive regardless of the situation. Is that, am I misstruing that, or is that kind of the difference between Elon's approach and Google's approach?
Well, I think, yes, I think you generally have it, and certainly that fits with the marketing. In other words, I think Elon Musk is really trying to make the argument from a marketing perspective that his solution is going to be more scalable. And I think he's right that fundamentally their development of this in real world robots is all built on the concept that they can interact with the world in an almost infinite number of ways. And that is really appealing. And it's not only Tesla. I mean, Field AI is another good example of a company that is really kind of looking to build core foundation models through the interaction of things like Unitary robots and Boston Dynamics spots with the real world. And insofar as those vehicles truly are embodied and truly do have the ability to sort of grapple with complexity and chaos, then I would totally agree that they pass my criteria. I do think Waymo vehicles are also embodied. I think the difference is that their interaction with the real world is really based around a map and based around a model. So Waymo is really, in some ways, very innovative, but arguably, and I don't mean this to be pejorative in any way, but arguably is really like 25-year-old technology in terms of the mindset, right? Because the mindset is that action should be based on path planning, and that path planning should be based on a map. And on hearing this, a lot of roboticists and self-driving people, and certainly a fair number of Waymo people, might have a very strong reaction. And they might basically say, like, what are you talking about? Like, that's what AI is. And I would say, well, that has been, to a large degree, what AI has been for the last 25 years, but I don't really want it to be that. Do you know what I mean? I'm basically saying, like, yeah, and it hasn't worked that well, and it hasn't scaled. And if nothing else, what we can say, just from a pure engineering perspective, is that the GPUs, meaning these general processing units from NVIDIA and other players, are so expensive and so onerous in terms of size and their impact on the environment and just generally their cost, that it really does beg the question, like, yes, this might scale at some level, but it doesn't scale the way that things in biology scale. Do you see what I'm saying? And if I need like $30,000 of processing on this like defense vehicle to map and model the world, well, that isn't going to scale from a business perspective. And this is where there is a basic tension. And I like to look at things from a business perspective, a biological perspective, and also just a practical, technical perspective, and say the brute force computation approach, which is clearly what is pushing Waymo forward and Field AI and a lot of these players, and I'm not picking on them, right? Because this is the wisdom right now. They're basically saying, hey, let me run my models on the best processors, and as those processors get better, everything will scale. Mm-hmm. But I'm looking at it and saying, well, remember, NVIDIA doesn't really want it to scale in a way that doesn't continue to provide them profit. You know what I mean? So you're still going to pay a lot of money for that computation. That's kind of their whole business model. So what if we could put everything onto like a $38 ARM processor, like a Raspberry Pi 4, for instance? And what if that, even if it wasn't quite so optimal, I don't know if you can see the air quotes in my video there. There you go. It's really important to communicate those air quotes. But yeah, I'm joking. It's not important at all. But where like the benefit in terms of massive, several order of magnitude reduction in computational requirements is worth losing out on like the theoretical optimality. So this brings up another point, which is in my thinking, the AI world traditionally, and their fascination with maps and optimal models, has really failed to understand that literally nothing in biology is optimal. And I think the vast majority of investors will say, oh no, that's what we like about AI. Do you see what I mean? If I know that this server in Mountain View can select for me the optimal route in my map, we know that it can actually make a much better map than what the human brain does. Look at how beautiful it is. Look at all these pixels. Look at this high definition, map which the system has built. I can recognize myself inside of this laser data, et cetera, right? And in looking at this, they can also, create for you a literal mathematical proof for how their path planner gave you the perfect path, right? And how this map is actually accurate to a centimeter or maybe even a millimeter. And it's very convincing. The problem is this. Why is everything in biology not like that? I mean, why does nothing in biology have a perfect map? Why does nothing in biology have a perfect path plan? If I tell you to vacuum the floor or mow the grass, you don't run this NP-complete like path planning algorithm to figure out the perfect way to mow your lawn. And again, investors...
My wife will tell me that.
Yeah, exactly. And literally, this is not me trying to be funny. This is me trying to give, in many ways, like this kernel of wisdom that I've learned in deep, dark tunnels, going under borders and sending robots into the unknown. If your environment is dirty and dusty and has rain and fog and snow and adversaries, and if you do have a high degree of uncertainty, your map is going to be a millstone around your neck. That thing that you believe is optimal is going to be what hems you in and cuts off your knees. Do you see what I mean? It is going to pull the rug out from you, and you're going to say, but David, I still need that map, right? And I'm going to say, absolutely not. One of the funniest things is that the robot that has made the most actual money and scaled the most is like the dumbest robot in the world. And I can say that because I love it, and I've been working with iRobot for years, couple decades actually, but it's the Roomba. The Roomba is not a highly cognitive AI system, but it's selling. And part of that reason is not that it lacks intelligence in the strict sense. It's that, ironically, the intelligence which it has is perhaps more real because it is not map-based. Now, even people at iRobot right now might say, oh, but David, we've been working on doing maps, actually, because we do want to infuse that intelligence. But I'm making a more philosophical point, which is not that we shouldn't use maps. I use maps, I use Google Maps, I use Waze, I use those things, but it is not the source of my intelligence. Do you see what I'm saying? The fact that I use them does not mean that they are part of me. And I think that distinction is actually philosophically very important, because if the map turns out to be wrong, which can be for very simple reasons, right? It could be that my GPS is wrong. It could be that all the doors have now closed inside of this environment. So the path planning, which was based on open doors, now no longer is really valid. You see what I mean? It could be for literally all kinds of reasons, which is that my robot is in a Budweiser bottling factory and all the bottle stacks keep moving. Or it could be that my forklift and its autonomy needs to guide its way through 300 moving vehicles in a construction site, and they're all constantly moving. And my point is, if you're in one of those environments, the whole definition of intelligence now needs to change. It needs to be much more about flow and interaction with your nearest neighbors. Just like in a soccer game, back to Messi. What makes Messi brilliant isn't that he can write long essays on the game of soccer. And those long essays don't actually help him play soccer better. Do you see what I mean? What helps him play soccer better is his wall passes. And by wall passes, I mean give and go passes that occur in tiny fractions of a second, and which do not require NVIDIA GPUs or even the biological equivalent of NVIDIA GPUs. And I'm not picking on NVIDIA. I love using Google Maps to guide me through a city. I'm a moron when it comes to understanding my sort of geolocation. But if I'm trying to drive my car through crowded parades, I need to rely much more on my instinctive nearest neighbor local environment intelligence and much less on my Google Maps or my NVIDIA servers intelligence. And that difference is incredibly important. And it's not very well understood, because one of the ironies, and this is like a little funny anecdote, but I have often wanted to do a test where I take like a human being to an investor. And I basically present the human being as an intelligent entity. And I have it vacuum the floor, right? And I have it mow the lawn. And I have it draw a map. After which time I compare it to, a cognitive AI doing the same task. And the investor would look at the pretty crappy map that the human makes, right? And then look at this gorgeous map that the robot makes. I would have it compare the optimal path planning of the robot to the really kind of stupid, wrong, suboptimal path planning that the human does. And I would make all of these little, comparisons the way that AI investors look at intelligence right now. And very clearly in my mind, the human will come short. But if I start screwing with the environment, it is the human that will win. And I know this for sure because I fielded all of these different robots with what I like to call mixed initiative intelligence, which allowed that wonderful ingenuity of the human to come into play. And in those environments, the human always won, and won by a long shot. But I'll end here by saying that in every single one of my experiments, and we have over 1,200 users involved in formal experiments that we did on the subject, it was always shared control that won. And what I mean by shared control is teamwork between the human and the robot. So in many ways, I would argue that the concept of full autonomy is in and of itself kind of dumb. I've made the argument to the military many times that we have 0 autonomous humans in the military. So why the hell are we trying to make autonomous robots? It doesn't make sense. What we value is teamwork, right? And most of the time people are like, David, that's sort of a silly semantic distinction. I'm like, no, it's not a silly semantic distinction. Designing systems to be humanity-centric is like the entire point here. And even if you don't believe that, and you think that the goal is eliminating humans, which I think is sort of, at its heart, not a good idea, you still have to put up with the fact that in every single real test that I have done with robots in the real world, the shared control wins out. And so if that is true, then to some extent, I think this so-called AGI goal, the way it's being established, is somewhat artificial and maybe even chillingly wrong. So that's kind of me saying, hey, it's not that I'm against the pursuit of AGI. It's more that I want us to be honest about our real goals. I want us to be honest about our goal of being humanity-centered. which is very important to me. And I want us to be honest about the value of teamwork from a performance perspective.
It's all very informative. I'm going to be honest. You're throwing out way too many points for me to counter because by the time I've thought of a few. You've moved on to something like 10 more points. So if we could back up and slow down a little bit, I think we can unpack some of that. Like first off, the capacity of GPUs is increasing, and the argument is that Jevons paradox there will always be an infinite more use of these things as they become more capable. So we don't need to, NVIDIA doesn't need to worry about lack of people to buy their product for a while. But I would love to dive into this cyclical investment that we're starting to see, where like NVIDIA says, I'll give OpenAI $1 trillion, and OpenAI says, okay, we'll agree to use your Blackwell chips for 10 years, and then you get, like, there does seem to be like this circular flywheel of kind of hypothetical investment going on amongst a lot of these companies that even I, as like a total techno optimist, is starting to go like, wait a minute, this is looking a little fishy. Like, is this sustainable, or are we just kind of like throwing numbers up in the air and doing whatever the hell we want? And at some point in time, somebody's going to have to pay for all this. So starting there, do you see a problem in the business landscape outside of the fact that the technology may not be that effective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and really practical from a business perspective. I think we are seeing a very strategic, very cunning inflation of the value of large language models. And it makes perfect sense. Like if you've seen the movie The Big Short, that looked at the mortgage crisis and why so many supposedly intelligent people propped up a failing system. It's exactly the same thing here, or at least similar, in the sense that once you've made, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, it's psychologically almost impossible to embrace the possibility that there's going to be a crash, or that there's a bubble, or that the, value, which will be sort of reaped and harvested, is going to be less than you would imagine. It's just very, very difficult, I think, for a human being to say, maybe we were wrong and inflated. It's just not going to happen, right? And so it is interesting that Altman and Bezos right now and others are acknowledging explicitly that there is an AI bubble. Just in the last 2 weeks, there's been a lot of discussion of that. I'm going to give you my thought real quick, which is Mark Andreessen recognized that software was going to be dominant over hardware and quipped that software was eating the world. And then NVIDIA's CEO recognized that AI was going to grow and blossom and develop, and said that AI is going to eat software. And both of them were correct. But I'm going to tell you that swarm intelligence is going to eat AI. And when I say eat AI, I mean specifically large language models. And even more so than just the idea of eating large language models, I mean eating the idea of, quote, individual AI. Because my belief is that everything that works is a form of collective intelligence. Even our own cells, even our brain, the way in which we play soccer or invest in the stock market, they're all really examples of what I'm calling swarm intelligence. And so when I talk about swarm intelligence, I don't mean GPS-based swarms, which is what we've seen in the drone world, and I don't mean swarms the way that they're talked about in the military right now. I mean true swarming. And I also don't even just mean like ants or bees. I mean more this underlying principle, which says that the intelligence will emerge not within the individual, like the individual cell or the individual neuron or the individual computer, but really in the embodied interactions. And in the brain, that is what we see. We see a phenomenon called re-entry, where clusters of neurons form around a purpose. Do you see what I mean? And that is what gives us real general intelligence. And it's a phenomenon which is what we find in every swarm. We also see another phenomenon which is really important, which is called stigmergy. And that word was coined by French entomologist Pierre-Paul Grasset in 1952, where he recognized how ants were using pheromones to displace command, control, and communication into the environment. And this principle is incredibly important. It might be deli drivers honking, right? It might be crickets chirping. It might be the U.S., roadways deciding to put up billions of dollars of cat eyes on the road. But these are all examples of saying, hey, maybe map-based intelligence, maybe model-based intelligence isn't sufficient in and of itself. Maybe we need to create a robot-readable world, which is one of the phrases that I've been thinking about, this concept of doing our robot friends a favor and embedding command, control, and communication into the environment at some level, right? Because certainly we are intelligent, but we have seen the need to do that for our drivers. We put up signs, we put up cat eyes, we put up traffic lights, we put up infrastructure. What's so fascinating is that in this AI world, that is considered anathema, right? Everything should just be software in my server.
There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture.
Okay, we're back. I'll have a slight break there. You were discussing the hive mentality and how much more efficient that is than what we're trying to do with AGI and single model intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. I think the reality is that swarm intelligence is not only more fault tolerant and resilient, it also dramatically limits the need for expensive GPUs and processors. So I'm really excited about how in the future we can kind of combine the three different pillars that I believe contribute to AGI. So let me explain briefly what those are. I think the first is sort of the most obvious, which is the intrinsic intelligence that allows an individual to go out and interact with the real world. The second, though, is this cloud-based intelligence, which is sort of separate and which right now is sort of being done by these maps and models and the kind of cloud intelligence. And indeed, if I am driving long distances, I'm accessing that cloud intelligence also. And then thirdly, there's this third thing that isn't discussed very much, and that's swarm intelligence. And that really has to do with the way in which command and control and communication is embedded into the environment. And it's in the way that we interact with our peers. So again, a wall pass in soccer is an example. Honking on a horn, if you're a driver in New Delhi is an example. Crickets that are chirping, even a factory robot that's following a line on the ground is an example of what I would call embodied interaction with the real world. So the question is, how do we use those three pillars to get real world tasks accomplished? And so far, I think there's been so much emphasis on the cloud within sort of the app world use of AI. And then a lot of emphasis on the individual intelligence within the so-called self-driving world. But there's been very little emphasis on the swarm intelligence. And that's why I think our systems don't scale as well as they should.
Yeah, I mean, I think I hear a lot of this in the business community around like specialized agents working together rather than just having an agent that can do everything, or even smaller models. Mir Murati's company is Thinking Machines Labs is wanting to fine-tune models for individual businesses. So in my mind's eye, really what you have is like that cloud is your foundation models, right? Which have the overall capability to do a whole lot of very vague stuff, but it's pretty vast. And then you have your smaller proprietary, probably on-prem models that are more established and have agentic workflows within them. And those agentic workflows are all very single task oriented, but then an MCP server serves as kind of that the honking horns or the cricket interface so that they all know how to interact with each other and move around. And I think that you're not alone in thinking that way. The thing that I think is going to be hard about getting that off the ground is that these people have spent a lot of money and they're still spending a lot of money, and they see the consumers like just like a social media company does. Like they want to make something that a business can use effectively at the same time a consumer enjoys interacting with it, and that's not really possible. Like I don't want a sycophantic AI helping me develop my business strategy. And just the same, I probably don't want a real critical AI like to be my buddy AI, even though I could give two shits less about buddy AIs. But a lot of people in the world like that model, and so they see money in it and they want their cake and to eat it too, and that is problematic.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, a lot of it comes down to what we're really trying to accomplish. Like, I think the realization is that when most people talk about AGI, what they really want is to eliminate humans. And I think that's problematic. I don't want humans and machine intelligence to evolve along the same trajectory. That is not, to me, healthy. It's just silly. It's okay, I guess, from an academic perspective to pursue different trajectories. And so I don't look to judge other individuals or the work they're doing. But for me, at least, I think trying to eliminate humans, either to replace them from a workplace perspective or to give management more control and power, or to sort of service what I call the corpocracy, which is sort of the ability of corporations to tell people what to do. All of that seems very bad to me. But also from an engineering perspective, I think that the model-driven approach to large language models is fundamentally problematic from a scalability perspective. So I feel like what we need to understand more is the interaction between intelligent agents and specifically between AI agents and human beings. So you have N humans and N AI agents and then N robots. Does that make sense?
It does.
You may have agents in the cloud, you may have robots, and then you may have humans. And the question is, how do they work together? And amazingly, although to me, this is the most important question for productivity and for success in terms of task completion, it's sort of the thing we have studied the least. And I think part of the reason is that from an investment perspective and from a government perspective and from a corporate perspective, the number one function, which has been discussed, is taking the labor column in your spreadsheet and eliminating it. And what's so amusing about this, and also horrifying at the same time, it's amusing because it's literally never happened for anything but factory robots. And sure, maybe a few other cases, but most of the complex real-world stuff that I've been doing, it has not been true in those environments. Amazon wanted to use Kiva to eliminate the humans, and it didn't happen, right? They did improve productivity. In the military, Future Combat Systems, starting in 1999, launched this whole Vision 2020 program about eliminating 50% of our unmanned, of our forces with unmanned forces. And so literally they're saying, like, let's get rid of 50% of the humans in the military. And it was literally passed into law by Congress, which a lot of people don't know. But it did not happen. Because here we are, it's past 2020, from a chronological perspective, and we didn't do it. What we did do is get thousands of robots out there to find landmines, to find bombs, to, improve convoys. And that is brilliant. We removed the human from harm's way, but we didn't eliminate the human. And so the thing that is puzzling is why we keep returning to that as the model. In other words, when I say that, I mean the elimination of the human.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. I do think that we are seeing, and I haven't been in the tech world my whole life. It does seem like we are seeing iterations that are more and more rapid of models. I mean, if you look at ChatGPT 3.5 when it first came out in November 2022, like, difference between that and ChatGPT 5 is night and day. They didn't used to be able to figure out how many R's are in strawberry, and now they're winning like the World Math Olympiad. So the technology is advancing. The concern that I have on the labor force is, I agree with you. I think, because I'm a marketer, I'm a writer, right? And when I talk to students, I'm like, what this does is it takes you from just being a creator to becoming an editor. Now you have a whole symphony of tools, and you can produce a whole lot of copyright and marketing video and everything else, and your taste and discernment is what makes that go to market, right? But what happens then when we perfect all that and we end up with like 30% of the United States who are all high achievers, self-driven people using AI to do all the work, and the 70% of people who kind of like to rest on their laurels don't have a whole lot of use in industry?
Yeah, it certainly does place more of a premium on imagination, ingenuity, on problem solving. One of the points I made in a TechCrunch article was that maybe, hairdressing and janitorial work will become, the highest paid jobs, because they are indeed jobs that really kind of emphasize the human element. In other words, if I go to a hairdresser and I say, I want the George Clooney cut, but I want it to be kind of like messy and fun, the AI is going to struggle not only with what that means, but also with how to relate that to your head and your hair. And more importantly, the conversation you have with your hairdresser, the way in which there's touch and body language, all of that is really important. If we look at the janitorial role, if I'm a superintendent in a New York City apartment, I've got to change out not only light bulbs, but like I've got to fix radiators, where I can no longer get the part that I need. I've got to be MacGyver like all the time. Do you know what I mean? And basically, I'm here to tell you that there's no humanoid out there that's going to be able to put like the dexterity into getting that rusted bolt off from, underneath the sink, where you have to reach around and get past like all the plumbing stuff. It's just so freaking hard, right? So is there like a janitorial robot that's going to go do that? Absolutely not. Do you know what I mean? Absolutely not.
I do.
So maybe it's the surgeon or the teacher or the professor where we say like, honestly, we can replace you like today. Although even there, to use a really kind of intricate example, some surgeries, I think, will require human-like dexterity, and then others, are done by the Da Vinci, system and actually may work better with a robot. Or the Da Vinci system is an example of what I've been arguing all along, which is that maybe it's the robot and the human working together that produce the best results, right? So those are really difficult issues because there is no clear function or algorithm to compare the human proficiency and the human. It sort of has to be derived in the context.
Agreed, and I think those are the conversations we need to be having. In healthcare, people are going to want somebody with him. But the doctor that worked on that Da Vinci model, I read his book, and one of the things that he brings up that we're not talking about is if the average GP has 7 minutes with a patient and 4 minutes of that is currently note taking, if we can alleviate that 4 minutes with AI, are we going to allow that GP 7 minutes of FaceTime, or are we going to say you need to see 2 people every 7 minutes now? Like, are we going to use this to optimize how we relate to each other as humans, or are we just going to say, oh, good, more productivity, so that leads to a higher bottom line, and the only people that really get anything out of it are way up the ladder?
Yeah, that's a profoundly important question. And I note that is not necessarily an AI question. That is a question about how we structure our, economic and business environment. But I think we kind of know intuitively the answer, which is that corporations are going to try to push for profit. And they're going to do it in a way which unfortunately is not humanity-centered. And so this is sort of the point that I've been making, which is that this conversation that's so important to our hearts has very little to do with the question of is AI good? It has to do with the question of are the decision makers, which currently are human, taking into account the human soul when they make these decisions. And I would argue that corporate AI, the way it's being done, is really optimizing profit, not the human experience. And in fact, could we use AI to trace value and to trace human impact? Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're not. To be very clear, we are not.
No.
So,
No.
The number one thing that I would advocate we should do with AI in its current form is understand how these choices are impacting our daily lives. Not from a philosophical perspective alone, but from also a very practical perspective. And I think when we look at the use of AI right now, that is astonishing that for the first time in human history, we could be tracing this impact and we could be providing what I would call mechanisms of actionable feedback. And in fact, we're doing the opposite. We're sort of hiding that and we're not looking at the impact. And that's really disturbing to me.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I work in mental health, and like the large community mental health centers could easily use machine learning to figure out how to optimize patient outcomes and what it means when every patient with a mental illness sees a different nurse practitioner every 2 months and gets their meds changed. And we don't use it for any of that practical stuff at all. But I want to go back to one thing that we were talking about when it comes to robotics, right? I know the mining industry, at least I've heard tell of the mining industry, kind of replaced people quite a bit with robotics at one point in time. And then their idea was we're going to retrain these miners as people to kind of upkeep this system. And those miners didn't want to have anything to do with that. Like a lot of physical labor people just telling the white collar workforce doesn't worry me. You replace my job as a chief strategy officer, I better learn how to be something else, like chief product manager or whatever. Like that's kind of expected. But in the blue collar workforce, a lot of people, I was a commercial fisherman at one point in time too, like their entire life and identity is tied up in the physical labor that they're doing. So if we go, dark factories like China and robotics replacing a whole lot of this stuff, like how do we find meaning for the people who those robots are replacing?
Yeah, well, you brought up the question of meaning. And that is indeed like one of the most important things to talk about here. Like what gives our life meaning and what arguably gives robot work meaning. Even if you believe that robots will never have a soul, even if you believe that robots are just tools, even if you think of them as appliances, you still have to face the question of like, does their work have meaning? And I would argue if we use robots to find landmines and remove them, then that's very meaningful work, right? If we remove humans from danger in the mining environment, that's a really brilliant thing and very meaningful. So to me, the question is, what are our intentions? And then secondarily, how are we impacting the value chain? So I actually know a lot about the mining world, both because I've done large scale autonomy projects with mine companies, and I also was the technical lead for the MEOS Mining Consortium. One of the things I found was that, again, the number one idea was to eliminate the human driver. But honestly, the human driver was sort of a drop in the bucket when we look at the overall value chain. And so whether you have a human driving the vehicle or not is sort of less important than the efficiency of the system. So when you look at the efficiency of the system, you think about coordination, you think about flow, you think about bottlenecks, and none of those things have anything to do. And my point is that those things remain as challenges, whether there's a human in the individual vehicle or not. And secondly, most people would say, oh, so you mean you need AI to coordinate? And it's like, well, maybe, but a lot of the coordination issues have more to do with positioning and timing accuracy than really with AI from a planning perspective. In other words, no matter how much emphasis you put on planning, if the GPS data is wrong, and it certainly is for these areas with multipath, it certainly is underground, then the coordination is not going to work no matter what. The other thing we see in the mining world is that the real value has to do with things like docking and transferring ore. And those environments are really very much human environments right now where decisions have to be made. And there's a lot of sort of real world interaction that currently needs to be done by humans. So even if you eliminate the human driving element for these long stretches, it's actually the efficiency of the tight, cluttered transfer environments, or what generally the mining industry call like the mine to mill problem, which means how do I deal with all the rest of the stuff besides just removing it from the ground and driving it, right? So I think, if we look at the mining industry, certainly the focus was on automating driving, which was ironic because so much of the value isn't in the driving. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I think in every task and in every situation, we really need to look at the context, and we need to go beyond just saying, hey, I've got a need for, quote, autonomy. We need to say, autonomy for what? And I see the same thing in the military. I did a podcast with, a 3-star general who said very clearly, I don't want to hear anymore about your automatic driving. I want to hear about how you're going to do my mission. You see what I mean? And then you have to say, well, what is that mission? Is it finding chemicals? Is it mapping out radiation? Is it finding bombs? Is it providing a, fire control? Is it looking for search and rescue? I mean, there's so many different missions. And this is where the robotics community and the so-called autonomy community needs to really listen to the customer and needs to understand the domain and what is really needed. Maybe, yes, the platform should drive autonomously, but the arm gets controlled by the human. Maybe the decision about which wire to cut on the bomb gets made by the human, but the actual movement of the arm joints gets done by the robot. You see what I mean? And all of those details are super important.
I want to ask you a philosophical question, though, that I've been kind of pondering in my own head when it comes to advancement of artificial intelligence and its ability to do some of these more difficult human tasks, which is, are we slowing it down by expecting it to do it the way that we would do it? If you look at AlphaGo versus AlphaZero, when they stopped using human experts to train AlphaGo, which could already beat every human expert, and they just gave it the rules of the game or the objective of the game and let the machine figure it out on its own, it was exponentially better than the one trained on human. So are we almost limiting some of these computer systems by expecting them to come to the outcomes by using our way of thinking?
That's a really good point. The way I say it is, the customer is always right, but they often lack the ability to articulate their requirements correctly. You know what I mean? And one of the points I, kind of found in working with the military is that ideally you have this sort of ongoing optometry test. And what I mean by optometry test is that if you went to the eye doctor and you said, here's my 300-page document I wrote up on my requirements. The optometrist would be like really, confused. Be like, I know what you want, man. You want to see sharper and clearer and further away, like, right? And you'd be like, well, yeah, but I wrote up this 300-page document, so I really want to read it. And ideally, this will take 7 years for us to agree to. And I say that jokingly because that's what's happening in many of these environments, like the military, is you have the 7-year requirements process that's incredibly sort of overbearing, and in the end is actually hurting us because at the beginning of the 7-year process, they don't know what to ask for. They are confused. They know they want certain basic things, like they want intuitive controls. We know that they want to be able to operate them remotely, and we know they want them to be reliable, just like sharper, clearer, and further away. So what the hell are we going to do with all these other 500 pages of documents? Like, how are they helping us? And when they say, now these are sacrosanct, it actually limits your ability to innovate. You see what I'm saying? And so in my experience, the successful robot programs, the successful AI programs are actually those where there's a little bit of give and take and flexibility and humility. So that in the end, you can go drink some beers with these guys and say, like, listen, I know at the beginning we said X, Y, and Z. To be honest, I never got Z to work. It's just not working. So we can either keep trying to do that, or maybe, could you try it like this? And they're like, well, that's not what we wanted. I'm like, I know, but can you just try it? Can you just try it like this? And then they try it like this, like, oh my God, this is fantastic. Honestly, this is way better than Z. And you're like, right, exactly. So can you just change the requirement so we can make this work? You see what I mean? So to me, that process, in the end, they will see sharper and clearer and further away, but only if I can put different lenses in front of their eyes, back to the optometry, metaphor, because I'm like, I don't know if they're going to like it or not. And honestly, secondly, I don't know if my engineers are going to make it work. So part of the thing is humility on both sides. And I think when we say, here are the rules, we really hem ourselves in. We limit innovation, we limit ingenuity, and we're way less likely to succeed. And most importantly, ironically, even though it was humans who wrote those god-awful requirements in the first place, the human ends up being very much in a worse position if we're not able to do the real-world testing and adaptation. And so in a weird way, the very thing I've learned about robot general intelligence, meaning that we need feedback, is the same thing I've learned about the production of robotic intelligence, which is that we need some feedback and flexibility. Does that make sense?
It does. And we've been going on for a while. I have two big questions for what you were just saying. Reminds me of Henry Ford saying, if I would have asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? They couldn't really see what they needed, which was automobiles. Let's go two big questions. All right, one, because you've worked with the federal government. One of my biggest concerns with all this, with the spend and the plans for the GPUs and all that, is we don't have the energy in this country to run anywhere near that. And China's putting up nuclear facilities like they're stacking Legos. Currently here, it takes about 10 years to get one past the regulations and built. Do you see any hope of the federal government figuring out the energy crisis that we're going to have if all this stuff comes to fruition?
Yeah, I do think fundamentally that swarm intelligence is orders of magnitude more efficient. Even right now, our sort of swarm intelligence solutions at a practical level use 1/50th the energy of these GPUs. So at the end of the day, I do think that this desire for optimality, and specifically path planning and model-driven solutions, is killing us. I think it's killing us from a functional perspective. I think it's killing us from what I would call a robust behavior perspective. And I think it's also killing us from an energy perspective. And I don't even know which of those three is worse. Do you know what I mean? Is it worse that I cannot really trust this self-driving system to work when there's dust and rain and fog and snow, because it's not really adaptive to the real world? Is it worse that I'm using 50 times more energy than I need because I want to run this big path planner on this big model, or that I have this big foundation model that I love, but which is requiring me to have $30,000 worth of compute stack? I don't know. But what I do know fundamentally is that the brute force approach is making some investors right now and some corporate owners very, very happy, but it's not making the average person happy. It's not giving the average person true benefit. And the question of, well, does it work, is answered. Yes, it does. GPUs work great, and large language models work to answer these questions, produce results. Yes, I get an answer. But the impact on humanity does not take into account any of the externalities. And your example of energy is just such a great example of an externality. What do I mean by that? I just mean something which is not in their model. When they say either to investors or to humanity, here's the benefit that we provide, they're leaving out this massive thing, which is like, and by the way, we're using all your water and all your energy to give you these cat videos that you didn't ask for. Do you see what I mean? You're like, well, maybe like my energy and water is more important than these like automatically generated AI cat videos. And they're like, no, I'm sorry, you don't get to answer that. That's not a question we asked you. Please watch the cat videos. It's going to be great. And like literally that stupid example about the cat videos is like the current state of things. We are being given a lot of like orchestration and cognitive intelligence that we did not really ask for and that we do not really like. And we are being told that it is good for us, but it is not. And the reason I know it's not good for us is that anxiety has now risen to be, literally like almost 50% of people now have anxiety. And why is that? Maybe it's because language driven or model driven AI in the cloud is controlling us like we're robots. And most people would say, oh, no, it's not control. I'm like, fine, whatever word you want to use, subtly influencing you. When to turn left, when to turn right, what books to read, what movies to watch, who to have sex with, whatever. And at the end of the day, you are not a discrete token in a large language model. You're a human being. That's the issue that we need to face. And secondarily, even if you don't care about any of that, like I said, what's going on in a bottle factory or in a parking lot or in a crowded, whatever mine is that the large language models are not dealing well with uncertainty and chaos. So even if we said, hey, I don't care about the human, I don't want to hear your sob story about ethics and whatever, I just want to make robots work, you still have to face this issue. And so yes, it's an energy issue, but it's more than that. It's more a fundamental question of like, are we generating intelligence in a way that is scalable? Or are we using a dumb brute force approach that puts all of the emphasis on servers?
So I have heard the argument that embodying large language models with the use of robotics would be a win-win for both industries, and that might be the key to get us to AGI, but it sounds like you don't believe that to be the case.
I'm not a purist, and I'm absolutely for the use of large language models and foundation models. I think it's interesting. I think it's valuable. I think when used in the right context, it's very powerful. One of the examples I give is there's a company, I won't name its name, but which really was able to drive robots very effectively in maps, assuming that things don't change. And so I said to the company, honestly, you should just do floor sweeping at night. Do you know what I mean? Like the environment doesn't change. There aren't chaotic, people and vehicles moving around. And you know what? That worked. So insofar as you can not only discretize your world, but you can eliminate the chaos, then great. Then that's a fantastic use for large language models and maps and all the stuff that the traditional AI world is trying to do. But you need to stay in your lane then. Don't tell people that you're going to create general intelligence and deal with chaos in the real world because you're not. Do you see what I mean? And so the confusion here is that the fact that a robot can play chess well doesn't mean that it can guide you through a crowded ice skating rink. You see what I mean? And the way in which I've been saying this to like 3 and 4 star generals to reduce it all down to something, again, less philosophical and more practical is just to say many AI companies desperately want to believe that they are playing chess, literally with their robot and with their life and with their, battlefield AI. But the war that we're seeing in the military and the environments that we're seeing in industry are often more like dodgeball. And if you are trying to strategize in a game of dodgeball, you might not do that well. Do you see what I'm saying? So the two things need to be contrasted, and it is possible to contrast them objectively. You need to look at the rate of change, you need to look at the uncertainty, and you need to look at the amount of obfuscation associated with your perception. And that is an engineering matter. So even if in my discussion of swarm intelligence versus map-based intelligence, you're like, I don't know what he's talking about. At the very least, you can appreciate that there is a difference between chess and dodgeball, right? And that's the core issue for me.
No, I get, and the swarm intelligence is more like having a team of people working on a problem or trying to solve dodgeball. I've listened to Demis talk about the fact that AlphaGo couldn't win at chess. It just that's not what it was made for. So when it runs into a game that it may be the best in the world or the hardest game ever, but when it runs into a game it's not familiar with, it sucks. The large language model thing, robotics thing. I want to ask you one more question. This is kind of a controversial one, but listen. Sex has been the big moneymaker in every industry forever, right? Pornography was huge in the internet. Like eventually somebody like Elon, who has the little sex bots in Twitter already or in Grok already, like is going to embody AI and you're going to be able to purchase that as a mate. How many years down the road is that?
Well, I think it's already here. I mean, I think to the degree that you want to, you can find an AI agent to stroke your ego. And to the degree that you want to, you can already buy a real doll, which will stroke you in other ways. So, I feel like the answer is like today, AI and robotic love at some level, where love is again in air quotes, is it's already here. I think the question is, number one, do you want it? Number two, how powerful is your imagination? Arguably, even in human relationships, there's a good degree of imagination involved. we imagine our partners to be, in many cases, different than what they really are. And so at the end of the day, I'll come back to this one kind of annoying word called truth. And in robotics, I think about it as ground truth. I think about the timing. Am I talking about a 1 second update rate or am I talking about a 1 picosecond update rate? One is more true than the other. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
And when we talk about resolution, are we talking about, 3,000 pixels? Or are we talking about 3 million pixels? One is more true than the other. So even though I think all truth is subjective, absolutely, and beauty is indeed in the eye of the beholder, I absolutely believe that. Some things are more true than others. And so again, the question is, when we think about relationships, how much truth do you want? Many people maybe don't want truth in their relationships, but in this case, I'm saying it both in a spiritual sense and also in an engineering sense, right? How much do you want to see the wrinkles in your partner's face? How much do you want your wrinkles to be clear in the conversation, in the Zoom video, etc., right? So I think we have to ask ourselves, are we trying to get rid of truth or are we trying to enhance truth? If we're trying to get rid of truth, then I think AI lovers is like going to work great. On the other hand, if you hunger for truth and intimacy and honesty, I think you're going to get really, really, really upset.
I don't disagree with you. I guess I was thinking more along the lines of like Ex Machina, the robot in that. How far away is that type of robotics? Are we talking 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Have you seen Ex Machina?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think we have physical robots that can be involved as lovers today.
So
So
we're
I guess zero is the answer then to your question. The answer
we're
is
kind of
zero.
there, and that I assume the point that you're bringing up, I think, is a completely more valid and different one, which we're already starting to see amongst young men in America, which is like, are you okay with having like this sycophantic girlfriend that's not really a real relationship, that's just telling you what you want to hear? And unfortunately, back to a point that you brought up earlier, I do think that social media and the algorithms that have created dopamine hits in all of us have tended some of our younger generations more towards that maybe being a yes answer. I mean, I'm 52 years old. Like I could take or leave technology. It's cool when it works. If you took it away tomorrow, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. But I don't think that's true of a lot of people who grew up, scrolling TikTok since they were 4 years old.
Yeah, and I think the answer is I am not okay with it. In other words, I very much want that kind of honesty and intimacy and truth, but none of us want 100% of the truth, right? Like, it's so we actually can imagine a situation where AI is used to mediate, almost like a counselor is in a, psychiatry environment or whatever. And I did think about that recently. I thought, sometimes I am unaware of social dimensions in a conversation, right? And my friend will be like, "Oh, dude, Dave, they are not on the same wavelength with you." And I was thinking about the use of AI in relationships in that regard. there's a Key and Peele skit where like Obama has a translator that he uses to speak to his wife, and I love that. So I'm like, that would be a great application of AI. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Where he could essentially tap you on the shoulder and be like, David, no, stop that line of discussion. Like they're not getting it, or like you sound like a jackass. Like or even though like you're being a jerk. Like I think that's like a phenomenal use of AI. But finding your partner and love in a relationship, no, I don't like that at all. Unfortunately, my phone is at 1%. So I probably do need to go. I think a lot of these topics are like incredibly important and valuable. So I think the discussion is super good.
Man, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I'd love to talk to you again, and I really thank you for your time.